to the Flix Forum podcast, where each episode we go back and we look at a Netflix original film in the order of release. This episode, we have Netflix 342nd film from 2021. It's the romantic drama called Malcolm and Marie. It's directed by Sam Levinson and stars Zendaya and John David Washington. I'm your host. Thanks for joining me today for this Flix Forum episode where I'm quite excited. This is a big film for me. I think this is maybe not necessarily a big film for a lot of people or for Netflix, but this is a film that when it came out, I made it sort of a must-watch viewing. So that's where we're at. I'm excited to talk about this one. As always, we will spoil this film as we go. So if you don't want spoilers, give us a pause and come back a little bit later on, because we kick the show off with the Fast Flicks, where we do a quick little summary of what the film is all about. So this one's about a film director, who wants to celebrate success, even though he's brought down to earth by his neglected partner. This is a two-person film, as you could probably tell from the cast. So this may not be for everyone, and that is 100% okay. Hopefully, if you haven't seen it and you do want to see it, give us a pause. But if you have seen it, maybe you'll enjoy my discussion on this, because we'll talk a little bit about how this one ended up on Netflix. And this obviously ties in a lot with what was happening in the world at the time, because this is definitely a COVID film. This is a pandemic film, which we'll see soon. So Malcolm and Marie, there are two characters around the world. The translations for this film. So in Israel and the Netherlands, it's just called Malcolm. Interesting. I think that's real. This film is more than just Malcolm. I get that the idea, the name Malcolm, and this, I'm sort of touching on things a little bit early, but obviously if you think about Malcolm, you think about Malcolm X, you think about things like that, but this is more than Malcolm. So I'm a little bit disappointed in that title for Israel and the Netherlands. In Chinese, it's called Opening Night. I get that. You take away the whole idea of the characters and just go with what the film's about. And in Arabic, it's called Malcolm and Mary. So maybe they don't have Marie as a name there as well. The tagline for this film was madly in love. Very lazy. I think that's a super lazy tagline. Anyway, let's talk a little bit about how this ended up on Netflix. So we're going back to 2020, where Sam Levinson and Zendaya, they were both involved in the HBO show Euphoria, which many people would know, and it stopped production because of the COVID-19 pandemic. The two discussed the possibility and idea of making a feature film project during the pandemic. Levinson pitched several possibilities to Zendaya, including a psychological thriller that they would film at her home. He then began to come up with a relationship piece that plays out in real time, and that's probably the closest to what we see in this film. John David Washington joined the project after Levinson read 10 pages of dialogue to him over the phone, saying, "I couldn't believe it. It was beautiful words I heard, and at the same time, very disturbing and visceral confrontations." If you've seen the film, you probably understand what he's talking about. After receiving approval from the Writers Guild of America, SAG-AFTRA, and the Directors Guild of America, principal production took place from June the 17th to July 2nd, shooting entirely at the Caterpillar House, which is a private home at the Santa Lucia Preserve in Carmel by the Sea, California. The film followed local COVID-19 safety protocols, including the entire cast and crew being quarantined during shooting, as well as 2 weeks before and after shooting. Daily temperature checks and increased sanitation measures were also followed. The crew included many members of the Euphoria crew, including cinematographer Marcel Rev and production designer Michael Grasley. Both Washington and Zendaya were responsible for doing their own makeup and picking out their own costumes, as there were no makeup artists or costume designers on set. No more than 12 people were allowed on set at a time, and the production also had to be kept very confined so that the cast and crew could remain undisturbed during shooting. The film was also shot on black and white 35mm film, and if you've seen the film, you'll understand sort of the visual impact that has as well. Because of all this, the project was, I'm pretty sure, the first Hollywood feature film to be entirely written, financed, and produced during the COVID-19 lockdowns. Some information once the film was released, I guess, that the age difference between John David Washington and Zendaya, I think it was about 12 years. He was 35 at the time and Zendaya was 23, and this caused a little bit of controversy. Zendaya did refute the criticism by saying that people are not ready to see her as an adult. And that's sort of, I guess, where, she's a Disney star, and it's probably a little bit weird. It's a bit like, you think about Ariana Grande from Nickelodeon, and you think about Selena Gomez, and, she was in Spring Breakers. You think about Ariana Grande and Wicked and these types of films now that they're adults now. You've got to accept them as adults. They're not those kid stars that you remember from your childhood. In September of 2020, Netflix did acquire the distribution rights for $30 million. They outbid HBO, Amazon, Searchlight, Metro Goldwyn Mayer, Apple TV, A24, and Focus Features. It was released theatrically in a few theaters on January 29th of 2021, and then streamed on Netflix from the 5th of Feb 2021. Deadline Hollywood reported that the film made hardly any money during its theatrical run because of the actual lockdowns that were happening at the time too. The film was the most watched title on Netflix in its debut weekend, but dropped out of the top 10 by its second. So a few eyeballs straight away, and then afterwards, not too many at all. In a 2021 interview with the American Film Institute, the director, Sam Levinson, revealed with what character the emotional core of the movie lies. It's inspired a lot, this is a quote from him, it's inspired a lot of very passionate reactions, which I figured it might. But I think the central difference between the two reactions is whether you view the film as a defense of the artistic ego or an evisceration of it. And I think it's evident in the fact by the end of the film, Marie kind of delivers about a 20-minute dissertation on his failures as a filmmaker and a human being. That it's quite clear who the emotional gravitation pull of the film is and who holds the power in that relationship. She's not the muse. She may have inspired certain things. She may have felt exploited. She may have felt like she wasn't given credit, but she's ultimately what holds his world together. It's very likely that he's not capable of being an artist at all without her in that regard. That's the director breaking down his own film, I guess. We're going to talk a little bit more about my breakdown soon, but that sort of makes it clear as a director and as a writer who he thinks this film lies upon. And I guess a lot of critics too would say that Zendaya is the core of this film. As I mentioned before, this did have a limited theatrical release from the 29th of Jan, Netflix from the 5th of Feb 2021. It was filmed from the 17th of June until the 2nd of July. It was nominated for 9 awards, and it did win 4 further awards, the biggest being nominations for Best Actress for Zendaya at the Critics' Choice Awards, as well as the Hollywood Critics Association Awards as well. What are the critics and audiences saying about this film? On Rotten Tomatoes, this sits at 57% on 250 reviews. That is a lot of critic reviews. It is rotten. The audience a tiny bit higher at 67%. That's on more than 1,000 ratings. So again, not too high. IMDb almost reflects that audience percentage at a 6.6 out of 10. That's on 42,000 ratings. So a few more ratings there. But this is where we go over to Letterboxd, where these numbers are phenomenal, really. Like Letterboxd, it sits at a 3 out of 5. That's decent. That's on 196,000 ratings. But it's been logged by 276,000 people. That's a lot for a Netflix film. That is an awful lot of ratings. Metacritic, it's on that traffic light system of whether it's green, yellow, or red. This sits in the middle. It's yellow for both critics and audiences. 53 out of 100 for critics. That's on 44 reviews. And the audience, it sits at a 5.9 out of 10 on 113 reviews. So realistically, you look at these numbers, not great. So what are my early thoughts? I've been hanging out. It's taken me all that time. That's like a preamble where you're like, I need to talk, and now I can get into what my thoughts are. So for me, okay, you might think, I guess, the bones of this story is someone being upset at not being thanked. And you would think that this possibly couldn't carry a whole film. For me, I think information is dripped so casually and carefully throughout that each argument between Malcolm and Marie gets more and more interesting. It wasn't repetitive at all for me, and I really do like this film. So this might be a surprise. I do like this film. I'm going against what everyone's saying, and I think this is a great film. So Malcolm, Marie, we're going to talk about both characters. You sit with these guys for over an hour and a half, and you don't actually know an awful lot about them, really, other than their negativity towards each other. So Malcolm, we're going to start with Malcolm. He's the, Malcolm. It's interesting. Malcolm and Marie's the title of the film. Zendaya gets the top billing. I'm glad. I like the way that they've switched up. But Malcolm, for me, this is a guy who he's trying to live on the high of this debut of his, debut film. I was going to say most recent film, but it's his first film. He's ego-fueled, he's angry, he's righteous, he makes everything about him, and he refuses to credit anyone who's led to his success. This makes me think, he's very insecure, and not only his creative work, but himself as a man, and those he surrounds himself with. And Marie, she brings out the best in him, but also the worst. He couldn't stand to think of her as his equal because of how obsessed with himself is, and how his film is received, and how others think about him. And he can't see how the person closest to him, Marie, actually perceives him. He rides this wave of being so criticized and marginalized that he ignores the own sort of roots of his own family, and actually being pretty well off, and not having his own story to tell. And that's where he tells Marie's story, and that's where it leads to her anger and not being appreciated or even acknowledged for him almost ripping her life story off. And we'll talk about her now, I guess, because obviously she's disillusioned, she's angry because Malcolm didn't thank her at the premiere of this film, which is literally her life story. She has a checkered past of substance abuse and wanting to make a career in Hollywood herself as an actress, and she can't get past the fact that the man she's spending her life with is almost pushing her aside. She existed in this film to counteract his negative qualities. She comments on his art, his life, his persona, and really, like, I guess what Levinson said before, she's the emotional core of this film. She is the one that, brings him back down to earth every time he thinks he's better than what he probably actually is. All right, I think that's a pretty good summary of both characters for me. I think we're going to talk about the director, Sam Levinson. You would know his name. Obviously, as mentioned before, he worked on Euphoria, and obviously the other big thing, which has probably been a bit of a disaster, is The Idol, that HBO show with The Weeknd as well. So there is two big things. Let's talk about some scenes. What are some scenes that I enjoyed? And I guess I think I'm probably going to discuss some lines that I really liked, and then maybe a best scene from each character. So some good lines for me. So Marie says, and I'm probably not going to go into detail about the context, but just these quotes that sort of resonate. So Marie says, in regards to Malcolm, that fictional characters get more empathy from you than me. And like I said, this is a battle between the two. This is a verbal battle between these two people and their anger and how they feel towards each other. Marie also says, I'm the only person who tells you you're an arsehole when you are. Like, powerful. And that idea of don't push away the people who ground you, because Marie then says, you're the neediest man I ever needed. This tells you about him. This tells you about who Malcolm is. There's a scene where both Malcolm and Marie, they yell, "I hate you," and scream at the same time, in sync. And then she calls him an arsehole, and then he calls her a mental patient. And that was just funny for me. That was a really, really good highlight of this film. Malcolm's best scene in this film, it's, the first reviews of his film drop, and it's put up on the LA Times, and we see throughout this film that, he's got this real hatred towards a female white journalist at the LA Times, and this ties in with Levinson, who I think at the same time this reflects his own life, where he got some negative criticism from a similar sort of stereotyped journalist from the LA Times. But the idea that the reviews dropped, and he's got his phone, it's loading, but it gets stuck behind a paywall. That was funny too. And then he doesn't have his credit card saved to his phone. That's funny too. And then he goes on this massive rant, which was great. So I think that was really good. And then for Marie, I think the best scene for her is when, towards the end, we've sort of gone through this whole process about how she's disappointed about not being thanked in the film, and how she was overlooked to actually star in her own story. And she walks into Malcolm with his knife, and we understand she's been using drugs in the past and those types of things, and she talks about how her antidepressants and she's not on them anymore, and she's not doing well, and she goes into this rant about she's never been clean, and she's cheated on him, and she taps this knife, and she stole from his mother, and all these really menacing sort of things. And then she sort of drops the knife and says, and this is all about authenticity, but she says, "Malcolm, that's what authenticity buys you." And he's like, "Damn, why didn't you do that in the audition?" It was just such a powerful scene. I really like that too. Now, the themes, the ideas in this film. This film says a lot. And I understand there's a lot of people that won't agree with what I'm saying, but to me, that these things all really rang true. Intimacy, that idea of intimacy between these two characters, like, what does it mean? Is it sharing stories about your life? Is it about acknowledging them, thanking for them, or keeping them secret? Because I guess something that yeah, I mean, if, like this film, this was made during COVID, and you're talking about intimacy. It feels so familiar because that idea of intimacy, when people were trapped in one spot for such a long time, that's what this night feels like throughout this film too. There's that idea of the love-hate relationship, that idea of hurt and pain and toxicity and using and abusing those closest to us. I mean, this really pushes the line between what you want to see on the screen between a couple as well. Film criticism, I touched on this before with the LA Times journalist, but hey, I'm doing it right now, and that's the point of film and art in general, is that you want an audience to see it. You want them to either love it. You don't want them to hate it, but that's okay if they hate it, because everyone in their sort of ideas about film and art, they're right, as long as they defend what they're saying, because they mention this too in the film, like what drives an artist, no one knows. It's the mystery of art, and that's okay. You don't have to have everyone loving what you're doing. That's okay, but you've got to be able to accept that criticism too, as long as it's constructive at times as well. Race plays a big part in this film too. We've got 2 black people playing in this film, and you do have a white director, which may make this a little bit more problematic, but in the film, white people think, and it's their idea that they understand how they can appreciate the black experience, when realistically the struggles of black people in this white dominated industry and world, it's not a good thing, because they mention, white people make everything about race. It's tricky. How tough is that when you feel so isolated in your own world? Trauma plays a big part too, especially through Marie. She highlights the female experience. She's, having men prioritize their feelings when she's had to go through addiction and overcome this, and the shame and the guilt with that. And that's a really tricky thing to play on as well. And as sort of touched on before, that idea of authenticity. No one's proud of where they started, but you've still got to stay true to yourself, and in staying true to yourself, hopefully respect those around you as well. So quite a lot there that I really, really dug in this film. What else did I take away from this film? I think, I mentioned before, this is filmed on 35mm. It's done in black and white, and I think that works so well with the cinematography, because the location, you're in this isolated one location, and they use most of the rooms in that house quite well as the exteriors. You get this shot of the car driving down the driveway. They go out in the backyard quite a bit as well. You've got the costume choices that really highlight those shades, as well as and I'm not saying that this is a good thing, but they use cigarettes in this film, and I know that they have to clearly state that there was no promotional money paid for cigarette use, but it's almost like this elegant reference to Hollywood of the past, and that sort of plays in with this film as well, especially when the film is all about a director and wanting to be accepted for his work. Some questions, some pondering, some ideas about this film for me. I think the question I guess you've got to ask about this film is, are these monologues? Are these literally 2 characters that are just pumping out speeches to each other with no interaction, or is this a real fight? I think the criticism of this film is that people think that they don't feel like real people. It just feels like that there's people dropping these massive big speeches at each other. But for me, realistically, did they really need to feel like real people? Isn't it okay to see a different sort of film where you have these big quotes and speeches and dialogue towards each other? I'm not necessarily sure that you have, in this type of film, and maybe that's just because I enjoyed this film, but I'm not sure that you need that. I think that there's also this idea that Levinson, he pushes, obviously he's got that past with a film critic, but he pushes the idea that the critics are almost wrong to do their job. I'm not sure, that's what people have said. I'm not sure that's the whole gist of it, but I mean, you open yourself up for absolute attack realistically with this film, and that's probably what's happened, is that critics have gone, you are literally bagging us, you're putting us down as critics, why would I like your film? And that's probably where this film didn't go as well as I probably should have. There is a line in the film as well where I think it was, cinema doesn't need to have a message, it needs to have a heart and electricity. I really like that, but and that's okay with your Marvel films or your entertainment films. You don't necessarily have to take a message out of it. For this film, I think there are lots of messages. As I sort of touched on, I think maybe the heart is missing, because the pain that these characters give each other, it's real. and I guess it hurts a little bit, but I think the performances are very electric. So I think that's an interesting sort of quote to play on with the actual film. Random one, why did they need to go to the toilet so much, or the bathroom? These characters are constantly sitting on the toilet. I'm not sure. I don't know. I'd like to know why that creative choice was made. I can't not touch on the director being white. I sort of mentioned on this before, I think, but from everything I've read, I feel like Zendaya and Washington probably had enough input into this film that it isn't necessarily like an auteur's piece of work. It's not the director's, it's not just his as a piece of work. I think this sort of knocks back a bit of the criticism about Levinson being salty about the poor reviews of his previous work too. I mean, of course he can bring that into play. This, he's a collaborative piece in this piece of artwork, but I feel like there's a lot of criticism about specific things. I feel like this was a collaborative process, and how could it not be when you've got 2 actors as well as a small crew? Was it 12 people or something? Those people are going to be so close together, bouncing ideas off each other. I can't feel that, I don't feel like Levinson as a director would have had to have been controlling when you've got such a small knit group that could all put their own input into this film as well. That idea, I think it's interesting. I can't remember I think it was Malcolm that said it, but you can't go to bed angry. It's a very interesting concept because sometimes the temptation is, if you're having an argument or a disagreement, it's like, I just want to escape. I want to go to bed. I'm going to pretend that I'm going to sleep. You won't sleep, but that way you're putting sort of, water on the fire to put it out a little bit. I thought it's an interesting sort of thing. Malcolm, this is tough. So the whole idea is that Marie's angry about not only not being thanked for her story being in the film, but the idea too that she wanted to be cast in the film. I think the idea, if Malcolm actually cast her, would they be having this argument? Would this film exist? And I think possibly they would, based on their personalities. I feel like they might be having an argument about the edit, or maybe he still didn't thank her for being in it as well. I feel like that this is the sort of couple they are. They're going to argue over anything. The last thing, mac and cheese. Mac and cheese plays a big part in this. This is that idea that Marie comes home and still cooks mac and cheese for Malcolm, even though she's super angry at him. I know it's a very American thing. Obviously, mac and cheese is you can access this around the world, but for me, I think my very early days at university, I was obsessed with mac and cheese. In Australia, we had, I think it's still Kraft. I think the American one's Kraft as well, but it was in like these, packs. I didn't do it over the stove. You put it into a container, put some water and the powder over the noodles, chucked it in the microwave, and you were good to go. And I almost ate a packet sort of in between every 6 or so beers to sort of, I thought that it sort of made a hangover less impactful. But we had this nacho cheese flavour. It's not made anymore. You can't find it anywhere. And I swear, every couple of weeks when I walk down the aisle that has those instant noodles, I still check the shelf just in the hope that possibly they're back in production. So nacho cheese Kraft Easy Mac in Australia, that was the best. Absolute best. Anyway, I've spoken enough. We're ready to wrap this film up. We give the film a rating out of 5. So I've touched on this at some stage already. I watched this when it came out. When it came out, I gave it 5 stars. For me, this film was amazing. And I think when it originally came out, start of 2021, that was in Australia, that's the summer. It's the heat waves, and that's the time when the Australian Tennis Open's on. And my review at the time was that I said it's better. The film was a better tennis match than anything you would see at the Australian Open. This film, it is a tennis match. It swings backwards and forwards between 2 characters. I also sort of said that I really like to see the actual film that our character Malcolm has directed. And when this feels like perfect timing, because John David Washington, who played Malcolm, he's just had a film released on Netflix called The Piano Lesson, and that's open to critical acclaim. I'm so intrigued. It just feels like it's all coming together. I've got to finish, and this is really poetic, but also very lame. I've got to finish with thank you. Thank you. I enjoyed this film. I love this film. I think this is a great film. I'm still giving this a 5 out of 5. I mean, this is such a good film. If you don't like it, that is fine. But for me, this is one of those films that I just rate highly. I think it's great, and I could watch it over and over again. Anyway, we are back next week, but before we talk about next week's show, we're going to plug our socials. We've got Instagram, we've got Facebook, and we have X, formerly known as Twitter. The question I just wanted to ask for this film is, would this work as a stage show? I think 100%. This is definitely easily adaptable to stage. I guess it could almost have been a stage show if we weren't in the middle of a pandemic, but definitely, I think that would definitely work. I'd sit there and be captivated in an audience, as long as you had, a good cast on stage. Anyway, next week, we have an international film from 2021. This one's from South Korea. It's a space western film called Space Sweepers. It's directed by Jo Sung Jo Sung-hee, and stars Sung Joon-ki, Kim Tae-ri, Jin Seon-kyu, and Yoo Hae-jin. I like a space film, so I'm interested. I'm keen. I think the last sort of spacey films we did were the bonus episodes for Zack Snyder's Rebel Moon. I wonder if this will live up to that. Other than that, give us some feedback. I hope you enjoyed this chat. As always, thanks for joining me, and I will see you next week.